Welcome to today's Mishnah Berurah class. We are going to explore the rules regarding traveling and being a worker, and how you organize your tefillah, how you organize your prayer, and also how you say the traveler's prayer, and also for prayer when you have your own Beit Midrash. This is one of those chapters where I'd like to say they should have made it into smaller ones, but they lumped it all together into 8 se'ifim. So that was the decision of the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch, and they decided to keep it that way. So let us discuss Siman 110 Kuf Yud in the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishnah Berurah. So let's talk about a case of Shas Hadachak. You are in a situation where you are in pressing need. Like what? Such as you are traveling, okay? Or you are in a place, you are pausing in a place where you are somewhat busy and you are concerned that people are going to interrupt you, or that you won't be able to daven with proper focus, a regular long tefillah. So what you do is you should say, after the first 3 blessings, a paragraph known as Havinenu. And you recite that, and then after you recite that paragraph, you recite the final 3 blessings. And it must be recited while standing. And when you get home, you do not need to repeat the prayer again. And we don't recite Havinenu in the rainy seasons, and not on Motzei Shabbos, and not on Yom Tov, because you need to add certain things. Now, the Mishnah Berurah explained a lot of this stuff. Okay. What is Havinenu? What is B'shas Hadachak? So let's start with B'shas Hadachak. So, Mishnah Berurah explains, when it is not a pressing need, then the Gemara says that Abaye cursed those who relied upon the paragraph of Havinenu to shorten the prayer service. Nonetheless, you do fulfill your obligation for prayer if you do this. And you don't need to make another attempt at praying a full Shemona Esrei. And some people, like the Eliyah Rabbah, are strict even after the fact that you do not fulfill your obligation. Okay? And later rabbis say that if it looks like you're going to miss the time for prayer, if you say a full Shemona Esrei, then you are permitted at that point to say Havinenu, because that's acceptable. Okay? Let's see. Busy place where you might be interrupted. Sounds like a shul lobby. Well, don't daven in the lobby. But yes, he probably means like if you were davening, let's say you got off the train. Let's say there was a delay on your train or something along those lines. That's that would be a more modern example of that. Okay? And we say that you don't recite it. You only recite it in the summertime, but not in the winter times when you have to recite the blessing on the rain. And your concern is that they're going to interrupt you, and that is when you're traveling and you're concerned about that. Okay, the people who are going to interrupt you are the people who are passing by on the roadway, because otherwise, you should, even when you're traveling, you could, as we learned earlier in Siman Sadi Daled, you could say the full one. So this must be that people are really going to be much more interrupting than you would be if you just stayed on your horse and kept riding, or stayed on your coach and kept riding. So those things are all potential issues. You also could have been sitting down. Again, these are all things we talk about similar. And he directs everybody to see the Pri Megadim for some more insight. We will not get into that right now. But the paragraph Havinenu, he explains, is a general paragraph that includes all the middle blessings. So we're talking about 4 through 14. Okay. Can you pray from memory while driving? Yes, you could. We talked about that in Siman Sadi Daled, because while you're sitting, people could pray from memory at any time. So that was a common practice. Okay, so the nusach of it, if we have time at the end, we can go over it, but I want to make sure we cover as much halacha as we can today. But it's brought down in the Torah and the Beis Yosef, so I don't want to. Maybe I'll make a separate video discussing Havinenu. I think that makes the most sense, and I'll post that later today. Okay. It must be said standing. And this is because, the Mishnah explains, because it's coming in the stead of your normal Shemona Esrei. Okay? So in a case of great need, you are allowed to recite this. And this is definitely better. To recite Havinenu. Why is my camera moving all over the place? They just did an update on Apple, and the camera is now having a crazy day with holding itself in one position. Okay, there it goes, making me dizzy. So it's important that you say the Havinenu, because it includes all of these other blessings, and the strength of this prayer is that it is better than a Shemona Esrei, which we already have decided that you could recite while traveling, because if you were to stop what you're doing while being distracted and could not focus on it, then that would not work for a Shemona Esrei. So in this case, you have a shortened version of Havinenu, and by pausing, you will not be interrupted or distracted, and that's the preference. If you go ahead and recite the Havinenu while seated, the Pri Megadim is not sure if you fulfill your obligation. So you can recite a full Shemona Esrei while seated, but not the short one, because this needs to be part of the original enactment, that you did this one in order to permit you to add one extra layer, i.e. the standing, while reciting it. So he seems to say that if you were saying it seated, you won't fulfill your obligation. So the Shulchan Aruch says you don't have to repeat again. Why? Because, you don't pray this in the summertime, because you need to say V'tein tal umatar in the blessing of the years. That blessing. And on Motzi Shabbos and Yom Tov, you have to say Havdalah in Atah Chonein L'Adam Das. And even if you wanted to wrap them all together, that blessing, right, and add it into the words of Havinenu, we don't do that. They didn't make the enactment that way. And the Beis Yosef discusses this himself in greater detail. The Magen Avraham also expresses his displeasure with changing the accepted nusach, the accepted written and format of Havinenu. So the Pri Megadim is not sure if you went ahead and altered the text of Havinenu, if you could do that. Okay? So he says you don't seem to fulfill your obligation. So Havinenu, if you look in the Chai Adam, that Havinenu is the thing that's prohibited to say if not Shas at Chak. However, to shorten every single blessing and say all of them is okay, as long as you get the essential part about it. And same thing too, to include Havdalah in them, even when you're shortening them. Okay? And the Chai Adam actually brings a shortened version in chapter 24 in his work. And that would seem to be okay if you had an emergency and it was not meeting the conditions of being the summertime and so on. Okay? So if it's in the winter time, you need to say the Berachas Shanim completely. So the Mishnah says that we discussed this law originally in 104.5 and in the Mishnah Berurah, which was to say that if people interrupt you, what you do. And so if they come to talk to you, or if they want to interact with you, so all those things are all discussed back there. So basically, what it is that you can try to start to say it and try to not respond to them. Boy, these camera settings here. Okay, let's see if that resets it. Okay, halacha beis, second law. Workers who are working, and they're doing their work for the homeowner. If he doesn't pay them for work done outside of their meal breaks, they can go ahead and take a break to recite the Shemona Esrei. But they cannot recite it as if they had a minyan and do Chazar Shashatz. Okay, that's called Ein Yoredin Lefnei HaTeva. They also can't do the blessing of the Kohanim. It's called the Siyas Kapayim. They can't do that. And if he is paying them to work during that time period, then they should say the Havi Nenu prayer instead. And nowadays, the custom is to not be picky about this, and therefore he allows you to go ahead to say the Shemona Esrei. Okay, so that's the general rule for now. Okay, which is that they will be able to go ahead and stop working, say a full Amidah. So the Berurah explains, you say the Shemona Esrei, and that's all 3 times. Okay, just like every other person, because he wants you to daven. Okay, so however, you don't have a full minyan. And if you go ahead and are paid to take the break, then we know that he means that he's not picky about it. Okay, and that's why you'd be allowed to say Havi Nenu, again, only in the summertime, and just like we mentioned earlier. However, the custom is to go ahead and leave time for workers to say it. And the Mishnah explains this includes the entire Tefillah, just like every other person who doesn't have this problem would go ahead and recite it. And he quotes another book that they are allowed to go ahead and go to shul to daven with 10. So apparently, the whole rule gets tossed out. And he also quotes the Magen Avraham. He says this is in a place where they're not particular about letting you go to shul. So, but nonetheless, you shouldn't go ahead and wait for a whole minyan to develop in doing that. Okay. But later authorities say that no, even nowadays they allow you to do that, especially if it's not going to take a long time to do it. What you could do to avoid this problem is something we'll learn about in about 130 Simanim from the Ramah, is that if it's very time pressing, one could go ahead and start the Chazar shots immediately. Excuse me. And that would mean that you could have some be your lifting ateva. So they're talking about over here where you're going to wait for a silent Shemona Esrei and then repeat the whole thing. However, you could go ahead and get the minyan together and have everybody daven when you do what's called a Heiche Kedusha, which is Yiddish for the half of a Shemona Esrei that we're going to listen to out loud, well, allowing us to say Kedusha together. It's funny words, Heiche Kedusha. Okay. Halacha Gimel over here. Let's say you're walking through a place where there are bands of wild animals, and there's also bands of thieves. So then you say an even shorter thing that's called Sarchi Amacha Merubim. And you do not need to say the first 3 blessings or the last 3 blessings. And you can say it while you're continuing to travel. And if you can stop, then you should stop. And then when you get to a safe place, then you can go ahead and recite a regular Shemona Esrei. And especially if you get there and you're able to kind of soothe your thoughts, you can repeat a whole Shemona Esrei. And if you didn't repeat the Shemona Esrei, then it's considered having forgotten to pray. And we learned what those laws were in section 108, which we learned 2 weeks ago. So Mishnah is going to explain this. Now he says, so if there's wild animals and thieves, so that tells us that there's no way that you'll ever going to be able to focus on saying these prayers. And that's why you're completely exempt from reciting even Havi Nenu. But you still need to make a mention of the fact that it's important to pray. Some people will say this is an argument for prayer being a Torah commandment, even though we think of it mostly as rabbinic. But the idea that you have to pray is something that is a Torah commandment. So just to keep that in mind. That's not necessarily being stated over here, but this reason why you should go ahead and make mention of these things. But you repeat your service. So the idea is that you're not. So you say this because you're not sure if you're going to miss your time. So when we say you go ahead and pray again, it's assuming that you're not going to miss your time period. It's just that right now you're concerned that you might lose the time, and so you say a short prayer. Otherwise, saying this prayer is kind of silly. Okay, and therefore it's not considered. If you didn't go ahead and pray it, it's considered as for having to pray, which means that we said in the Ramah that even though you say this very short prayer, it's not really a prayer to be considered Shemona Esrei, okay, based on the main obligation to pray. And therefore, you should say a full Shemona Esrei when you get someplace, okay? And so this is saying that if you've reached someplace and you have the opportunity to go ahead and pray, you should do that. The problem was that when you were traveling, you didn't know at what point you would have that availability to safely pray, and that's why you say this short one. And that's why we're concerned about it, because maybe because of your being busy, you'll forget to pray, or because you're going to run out of time as you're traveling, and you knew that you weren't going to be able to focus like you would had you come to the place where you need to be. However, if you know any of these circumstances are possible and you don't say a prayer, this is considered a crooked thing that cannot be made straight, which we discussed earlier in 104. And if you don't pray, then you lose your opportunity to repeat the prayer service later on. Halacha 4. So he's not going to discuss the prayer known as Tefillah Sederach. So the prayer Tefillah Sederach is the following. You should say the following: May it be your will, Hashem our God and God of our forefathers, that you lead us in peace. Okay, and that is the first few words of it. And the Shulchan Aruch says, and it continues, so look in the Siddur under Tefillah Sederach, and you need to say it in plural, and you also need to pause from traveling while you're doing that. And if you're riding, you do not need to get out of the saddle. Okay, so and the Mishnah Berurah explains the Shulchan Aruch is saying that this law is being said even after you have just said your Shemona Esrei, and you ask that you should arrive someplace safely. So the Mishnah Berurah brings up the Gemara who says that when you depart from a person, you should not tell them go in peace. It says you should rather go to peace. And when you leave before being in front of a person who is departed, you should say in peace and not to peace. Okay, and the reason why is explained at the end of the Gemara Brachos. Okay, and the Maharsha over there. And if you have said Tefillah Sederach, if you say you should say it in the plural, if you said it for the individual, that's still okay. And if you can't wrap tefillin while praying, do you wrap at some other time and pray Shacharit without that? Good question. We discussed that a while ago, that when you recite the Shema, you should have your tefillin on. We discussed that quite some time ago. So that back in the laws of the Shema, you should definitely have your tefillin on while reciting the Shema. We didn't go into that in much depth in the laws of tefillin because we didn't cover the laws of tefillin during our review of Mishnah Berurah. We went straight through Hilchos Tzitzis and skipped to Hilchos Shema. But we did mention it in Hilchos Shema that you should have your tefillin on while reciting the Shema. And that's back in the 40 section, like 42, 43, something like that. Where was I? Okay, you should say it in a plural, and the reason why it should be said in the plural is because you need to say the actual intended nusach, the actual intended format that was enacted by the rabbis. And when a person goes ahead and requests something, it's not just for themselves for which they are requesting it, but really for the entire Jewish people. But when you're doing it for yourself, you can say it in a language that indicates that you're talking about one single person. It's also important, the Mishnah Berurah adds, that you should learn Torah while you're traveling. And we already have said That's someone who travels and they think about silliness and they watch their phone the whole time. He doesn't say the watching your phone the whole time, but is a person who is trapping their soul into some type of nefarious situation. It's not a good look. It's not a good thing. However, you shouldn't be deeply involved. You should recite things that are very common and easy to remember, because you might get distracted by getting too involved in halacha. Okay, and that's from the Gemara in Titus. However, a person who's traveling in a wagon, the Mishnah Berurah cites the Magen Avraham, so that if you're a rider and they're driving it, then you could do that, and you could even do some significant research while that's happening. It's also learned from the Gemara that a person should try not to eat too much while traveling, because being too full makes it difficult to travel. Okay, it also is bad for your kishkas, for your intestines. And a person should always try to have a little bit of bread with them, even if you're close to the cities from which you're walking from one to the other, because there's sometimes something will happen and you need to have some food with you. So having some bread along for the ride is a good idea. Excuse me. Okay, and some people say that that's when you're traveling a longer distance. And it's also, you should also make sure that even if you're going a shorter distance and you may not make it back home, you should take your talis and tefillin with you. Okay? However, because there might be, same thing with the bread, something might happen and you might get stuck, so take them with you so that you're nearby. And you shouldn't rely on the fact that you can go ahead and borrow it from other people. And because of this, people often miss the time for Shema and for Tefillah because they forgot to bring their own tefillin with them, and they're waiting for other people to finish before they have a pair. And also, you shouldn't worry about if you're borrowing from other people. The problem is that they're not necessarily so picky about how you put the knot in that it fits your head well. Okay. Now, if it's possible that while you're traveling in a crowd, that they'll wait for you to say the thing, you should stop. Okay. However, if it's really bad to stop, like you're driving animals and stopping is really bad, then you shouldn't have to stop. Why? Because getting up and down is a big deal. It's a big interruption. Okay, so therefore, this is because you're talking about riding an animal. Okay, so once you're riding it, it's going to keep going. And so too, if you're sitting in a wagon and someone else is driving you, you don't have to get out. But you should try to focus the horses a little bit to be on the road. With driving, that's basically the heter for driving. Is someone else says it in the car who's not driving the car. Okay, halacha 5. You don't have to recite Tefillah Derech once during the day, even if you're stopping off at another city in between the places where you're traveling. But if you were gonna stay in that town and then you're like, you know what, this place is terrible, I'm gonna leave and go somewhere else, you have to say a new one. You have to have in mind where you're going to, or if you're gonna return back to your home. Okay, and say it again. So if you change your mind about your journey, you have to say a new one. Mishnah Berurah explains that in every single day you should say it, as long as you're traveling. However, you don't have to say it wherever you're resting, because wherever you're going to stop is considered a place where you're coming to rest. So when you come to rest, you rest there, and then after you continue your journey on the next day, then you say another Tefillah Derech. Okay. But if you're going back to that city and you're not going so far, then you don't need to make a new blessing on this. And we said also that if you're going to travel to a new city, you change your mind while you're here. Like, here, I'm bored here. It's not so much fun. That was more fun here. So that's considered a hesed chadash. We talked about this a few times. You've changed your mind, or you've started thinking about something else. We talked about this before about tzitzis a lot, when you aren't really focusing on what you're doing now. And if you went ahead and stopped off at a hotel, for example, and the next morning you have to say a new blessing. If you were going to travel all night long and you get up before the night even ends, Okay, but you just take a little bit of a break as you're on your way there. Even still, you should make another bracha. Okay, and he says, however, you should make it again, but don't say the blessing at the end of it. Let's see here. All right, that was 5 of them. I think we're going to pause here. We'll pick up with the rest of this next time. We'll talk more about Tefillah Sederach. Thank you very much for joining today, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.